Amara Johnson sat at the far corner of the art classroom, her hands gently pressing into a block of cool gray clay. While the chatter of her classmates filled the air, snippets of gossip, laughter, the occasional clink of paintbrushes and water jars, Amara was somewhere else entirely. Her eyes narrowed with concentration, her fingers moving rhythmically as though they were translating her heartbeat into form. She wasn't sculpting for a grade. She wasn't sculpting for approval. She was sculpting because it felt like breathing. The room smelled faintly of turpentine and wet plaster, a mixture she had grown to love, though most students wrinkled their noses at it. Sunlight streamed in through the high windows, cutting across rows of half-finished projects, vases with uneven rims, abstract paintings splattered with hurried strokes, and a collection of clay animals lined up like a zoo. Amara's piece looked nothing like those. What rested on her work table was a bold, unfinished form, part human, part abstract, its curves and sharp lines woven together in a way that suggested both pain and resilience. It was a piece rooted in her heritage, inspired by the stories her grandmother used to tell her, tales of survival, of strength, of beauty carved out of struggle. She could already imagine it finished. She could picture the way it would stand as a reminder that art wasn't just about decoration, it was about truth. The others in the classroom didn't seem to see it that way. A few of her classmates leaned over to sneak glances, whispering to one another before stifling their laughter. "What is that even supposed to be?" one boy muttered under his breath. Amara heard him, but she didn't look up. She pressed her thumb deeper into the clay, shaping a curve with the patience of someone who knew what she was building, even if no one else did. For Amara, the classroom often felt like a stage where she played the wrong role. Her teacher, Mr. Whitman, seemed to favor neatness and tradition. He liked landscapes that resembled postcards, fruit bowls that looked ready to eat, and sculptures that imitated Greek statues. He called it discipline. But to Amara, it felt like limitation. He didn't see the fire in art that broke the mold. He didn't see what she carried in her hands. Her heart beat faster whenever she imagined showing her work, but she pushed the fear aside and let the clay answer instead. Sculpting gave her a voice that words couldn't. In the soft resistance of the clay, she found both challenge and freedom. Each indentation, each line she carved, was a piece of her story. And though she sat alone in her corner, though whispers swirled around her, Amara felt powerful in that moment. She thought of her future as her hands moved, of galleries of people stopping in their tracks, their breath caught by something she had created. She thought of her grandmother's words, "The world won't always see you, child, but your art can make them look twice." Amara held on to that promise as her sculpture began to take shape. The bell rang, startling her. Chairs scraped against the floor as her classmates packed up, leaving behind half-done projects and trails of paint across the tables. Amara lingered, brushing clay dust off her hands, carefully covering her piece with a damp cloth to keep it from drying out. As the classroom emptied, the noise faded, leaving her in silence with her creation. She touched the top of the sculpture gently, almost like a vow. One day, she thought, they'll understand. Would you like me to now continue with Chapter 2 in the same detailed cinematic style, carrying forward the moment where Mr. Whitman humiliates her in front of the class? The next morning, the art classroom buzzed with energy as students carried in their projects for the week's critique. Paintings leaned against easels, clay figures perched carefully on desks, and nervous laughter rippled through the room. Amara sat in her usual corner, unwrapping the damp cloth from her sculpture. Her hands trembled just slightly, though she tried to steady them. She had spent late hours smoothing and refining the piece, adding delicate details to the curves and ridges, until it spoke exactly the way she wanted it to. It wasn't finished in the traditional sense. Mr. Whitman always expected perfection polished to a shine, but Amara believed it already carried the soul it needed. When Mr. Whitman strode into the room, his leather shoes clicking against the tile, the chatter died down. He was tall, his gray hair neatly combed, his glasses perched low on his nose, as if he were constantly peering down at the world. In his hand, he carried the attendance sheet like a baton of authority. "All right, everyone," he said, his voice brisk and commanding. "Let's see what you've been working on." Line your pieces at the front. We'll discuss them together. One by one, students carried their projects to the display table. There were bright canvases with swirling skies, clay bowls with painted glazes, and even a papier-mâché mask painted gold. Amara hesitated before lifting her sculpture. It was heavier than it looked, dense with the hours she had poured into it, but she cradled it carefully in both arms. As she walked to the front, she felt eyes on her, curious, skeptical, some openly smirking. She set her piece down on the table with a quiet exhale and stepped back. Mr. Whitman walked down the line of projects, pausing at each one, offering commentary. Nice use of shading, he said to one student. Careful with proportion, he told another. His tone was measured, calm, encouraging enough to keep spirits afloat. But when he reached Amara's sculpture, he stopped, his brow furrowed. The room grew quiet, sensing the shift. What, he said slowly, adjusting his glasses, is this supposed to be? Heat flushed Amara's cheeks, but she stood straighter. It's a sculpture about resilience, she said softly. The form represents strength through struggle. The sharp edges show pain, but the curves show survival. There was a pause. Then Mr. Whitman chuckled. The sound wasn't light. It was sharp, dismissive, the kind of laugh that stings more than words. Resilience, It looks more like a lump of clay someone forgot to finish. He turned slightly, addressing the class. This, students, is an example of how ambition without discipline leads to, well, this. Laughter erupted. Not from everyone, but enough to make Amara's stomach twist. A few students covered their mouths, some snickered openly. Amara felt their eyes on her, their amusement washing over her like a wave she couldn't escape. She clenched her hands at her sides to stop them from shaking. Mr. Whitman shook his head. Art requires clarity, precision. If you want to express something, it has to be understandable, not this abstract jumble. He moved on without another glance, his tone shifting back to calm approval for the next project, as though Amara's had been nothing more than a mistake on the page. Amara wanted to sink into the floor. Her throat tightened, her ears burned, and for a moment she thought she might cry. But then her gaze fell back on her sculpture. Even beneath the ridicule, she could still see it. The strength in its lines, the story etched into its form. Her grandmother's voice echoed faintly in her memory. They won't always understand you, but that doesn't mean you're wrong. She took a deep breath, forcing herself not to move, not to shrink away. The laughter would fade, the sting would pass. What mattered was the piece in front of her, the truth it carried, and the fact that she had dared to put it there. As the critique continued, Amara sat quietly, her face calm but her heart pounding. She didn't know how yet, but she promised herself in that moment. One day, her art would make them see. That evening, Amara sat on the edge of her bed, the soft lamplight spilling over the small room she had made her sanctuary. The clay dust was still under her fingernails, though she had washed her hands twice. She couldn't stop replaying the scene in her mind. The way Mr. Whitman had laughed, the way the other students had followed his lead, the way her sculpture had become the butt of a joke rather than the expression of her soul. Each laugh had landed like a stone in her chest. She stared at the sculpture, now sitting on her desk beside her sketchbooks. The rough texture of the unfinished clay caught the lamplight, casting uneven shadows across the walls. To her, it still looked alive. It still carried the weight of what she had felt when she shaped it. But the voices of the classroom pressed against her thoughts. What is that supposed to be? A lump of clay. Ambition without discipline. Her throat tightened. She hugged her knees to her chest, trying to hold herself together. For a few minutes, she let the silence wash over her, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the occasional sound of her little brother laughing in the living room at the cartoons on TV. There was a soft knock at her door. Amara? Her mother's voice was gentle, warm, carrying the weight of both authority and love. Without waiting for a reply, she stepped inside. Mrs. Johnson was still wearing her work uniform, a burgundy blouse and black slacks, her hair pulled back neatly. She took one look at her daughter's face and knew something had happened. Amara tried to straighten, to hide the storm in her chest, but her mother's gaze was piercing. Talk to me, baby. What's wrong? Amara hesitated, then the words tumbled out. Mr. Whitman, he laughed at my sculpture. He said it looked like nothing, like I didn't finish it. Everyone laughed with him. Her voice cracked, her hands gripping her knees tighter. Maybe they're right. Maybe it's not good enough. Maybe I'm not good enough. Her mother crossed the room slowly, her footsteps steady. She sat on the edge of the bed beside Amara, wrapping one arm around her shoulders. Look at me, she said softly. Amara raised her eyes, blinking against the sting of tears. Mrs. Johnson's face was calm but firm, her dark eyes reflecting a strength Amara had always admired. Do you know what I see when I look at that sculpture? She nodded toward the clay form on the desk. I see you. I see the heart you put in it. I see the courage it takes to make something that's yours, not something everyone else expects. That's art, Amara. Not everyone will understand it right away. Some people will laugh because it's easier to laugh than to think. But that doesn't mean they're right. Amara swallowed hard, her chest tight. But what if nobody ever understands? Her mother's voice grew firmer but never harsh. They will, because you'll keep making them look. That's what art does. That's what you do. You carry stories that other people are too blind or too scared to tell. And let me tell you something else. She reached out and cupped Amara's chin, lifting it gently. The people who laugh, they never change the world. The ones who dare to keep going, even when no one believes in them. Those are the ones who make history. Amara felt her tears spill over then, not just from the hurt, but from the fire her mother's words lit in her chest. She leaned into her mother's shoulder, and Mrs. Johnson held her tightly, rocking her the way she had when Amara was a little girl. After a while, Amara pulled back, wiping her face with the sleeve of her hoodie. She looked again at her sculpture. For the first time since the critique, she didn't see it through Mr. Whitman's eyes. She saw it as her mother did, raw, brave, unfinished, but alive. I want to keep working on it, she said quietly, her voice steadier now. I want to make it stronger. I want it to be something no one can laugh at. Her mother smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. That's my girl. Don't you ever let someone else tell you what you're worth. You already carry greatness. Now show them. As her mother left the room, Amara stood and walked to her desk. She ran her fingers gently over the clay, feeling its coolness, its potential. The laughter from earlier still lingered in her memory, but it no longer felt like chains. It felt like fuel. That night, long after her house had gone quiet, and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, Amara worked by lamplight, carving, shaping, breathing new life into the sculpture. Each motion of her hands was a defiance, each curve a declaration. She was no longer just making art. She was making a promise to herself, to her mother, to the world. A week later, the art classroom buzzed with a strange mix of energy and tension. Posters for the upcoming regional youth art exhibition were pinned up on the walls, their glossy colors announcing the annual event with bold letters, a showcase of tomorrow's creators. Every year, a handful of students from Mr. Whitman's class were nominated to represent the school, and those chosen would have their work displayed in front of critics, curators, and even scouts from major art programs. For most students, it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Amara walked into class quietly, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Her sculpture, carefully wrapped in cloth, rested in the large bag she carried. She had spent nights refining it, smoothing the edges, adding depth to its ridges, letting her hands carve her emotions into its form. Though she had improved its surface, she had deliberately left some rough textures intact, believing that imperfection told as much truth as polish. Still, a knot of doubt sat heavy in her stomach. Mr. Whitman's words echoed faintly in her mind. A lump of clay, someone forgot to finish. At the front of the room, Mr. Whitman stood by his desk with a stack of forms. His posture was straighter than usual, his tone clipped as he explained the process. As you know, the exhibition accepts only a limited number of entries. I've reviewed your projects carefully, and today, I'll announce which of you will be nominated. This is a privilege, not a right. Only those with real promise will represent our school. Students leaned forward in their chairs, whispering to each other. The air was thick with anticipation. Amara tried to shrink into her seat, bracing herself for disappointment. She couldn't imagine her name even crossing his mind after the way he had ridiculed her. Mr. Whitman began calling names. Lena Martinez, your landscape painting. Thomas Green, your glasswork. Cheers erupted for each, the chosen students beaming as their peers clapped them on the back. Amara sat still, her hands gripping the edges of her sketchbook, her heart pounding. Then, unexpectedly, Mr. Whitman paused and adjusted his glasses. His eyes scanned the room, then landed on her. And finally, he said, his voice carrying just a hint of reluctance, Amara Johnson, for her sculpture. The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by a few muttered whispers. One student in the back scoffed under his breath. Another raised an eyebrow, exchanging glances with a friend. Amara's mouth went dry. For a second, she thought she had misheard him. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat. While I have reservations about the piece, the panel reviewing the preliminary submissions felt it had an originality worth noting. So, Amara, congratulations. You'll be one of our representatives. Amara blinked, stunned. Her sculpture had been submitted? She hadn't even realized Mr. Whitman had turned it in with the others. Slowly, the realization sank in. Someone outside of this room, someone who didn't know her, had seen her work and thought it worthy. A rush of heat filled her chest. She wanted to smile, to let herself bask in the moment. But the eyes of her classmates weighed heavily on her. Some looked curious, others skeptical. A few smirked, as if waiting for her to fail. Thank you, she managed to whisper, though her voice barely carried beyond her desk. Mr. Whitman nodded briskly and moved on, his tone growing warmer again as he praised the next student. It was clear he wanted to gloss over her nomination, to treat it as an afterthought. But for Amara, it was anything but. She sat there, her hands trembling as she pressed the sketchbook to her lap. Her heart raced with conflicting emotions, disbelief, pride, fear, hope. The sting of Mr. Whitman's laughter was still raw, but now it was tangled with something else. Possibility. Later, when the bell rang and students filed out into the hall, Amara lingered behind, staring at her sculpture, as though seeing it for the first time. The rough edges, the uneven surfaces, the stubborn curves that refused to be perfect. They had been noticed, valued, chosen. For the first time since she began working on it, Amara allowed herself to smile. Not a small, nervous smile, but one that spread across her face, slow and certain. Her work was going to stand in front of strangers, in a space bigger than this classroom. Her voice, shaped in clay, would reach further than she had ever dared to imagine. That night she carried the news home. Her mother embraced her so tightly she almost couldn't breathe. Her brother cheered and danced around the room, and for the first time in days, the house felt lighter, brighter. Amara went to bed that night with her heart still racing, her mind alive with possibility. She didn't know what the exhibition would bring, but she knew one thing. The world was beginning to see her. The day of the regional youth art exhibition arrived with a crisp, chilly breeze that swept through the city. Amara woke before dawn, her nerves jangling in her chest like loose wires. The soft, golden glow of the morning sun hadn't even reached her bedroom window yet. But she was already dressed, her hair neatly braided, her outfit carefully chosen. She wanted to look confident, even though her stomach twisted with anxiety. Her mother drove her into the city, the sculpture carefully secured in the back seat, wrapped in protective cloth. The silence in the car was filled with unspoken emotions. Amara's nerves, her mother's quiet pride, the faint hum of possibility that lingered between them. At one point, her mother reached across and squeezed her hand. Whatever happens today, remember, your art already spoke loudly enough to be chosen. That means it carries something powerful inside it. Trust that. The exhibition hall was enormous, housed in an old, repurposed train station, with high vaulted ceilings and glass skylights that poured daylight into the space. The walls had been transformed into white canvases, lined with rows of paintings, photographs, and mixed media displays. Sculptures stood on pedestals scattered across the floor like silent guardians. The smell of fresh paint, wood, and faint perfume filled the air, mixing with the low murmur of excited voices. Amara followed the event staff through the rows until they arrived at her assigned pedestal. Her hands trembled as she carefully unwrapped her sculpture, placing it gently at the center. When the cloth fell away, the clay figure stood under the natural light streaming through the skylight. Its contours, once mocked as unfinished, now seemed deliberate, purposeful, each ridge catching shadows that gave it a raw, emotional intensity. Standing back, Amara almost didn't recognize it. Under the brightness of the exhibition lights, it looked alive. It looked important. Other students bustled around, adjusting canvases, fussing over angles, murmuring nervously to one another. A few cast glances at Amara's sculpture. Some were unreadable, others subtly skeptical. But Amara kept her gaze on the piece itself, as if anchoring herself to its presence. Soon the doors opened, and the crowd began to filter in. Art lovers, local critics, teachers, and even people from abroad drifted from piece to piece, sipping sparkling drinks and whispering observations. Amara tried to stand quietly near her pedestal, but her heart hammered so loudly she feared others might hear it. At first, people simply passed by, pausing politely before moving on to the more polished traditional works. But then, slowly, a shift began. A woman in a long navy coat stopped in front of Amara's sculpture. She tilted her head, examining it closely, her brow furrowing not in confusion but in concentration. She circled the pedestal, taking in each angle. Then she called over a man with a program in his hand, gesturing toward the piece. The man joined her, and together they began to discuss it in low, intent voices. Soon others gathered. One leaned in closer, as though the sculpture were whispering something only they could hear. Another jotted notes in a small leather notebook. Amara's throat tightened as she watched the cluster grow. She overheard snippets of their words. Bold, raw expression, uncompromising honesty. Words she had never expected to hear in connection with her work. Her chest swelled with a mix of disbelief and fragile pride. But then came a familiar voice, sharp as a blade. Mr. Whitman had appeared, speaking to one of the critics nearby. His tone carried that same clipped, dismissive cadence she had grown used to. It's unconventional, yes, but frankly, it lacks polish. Amateurish in execution, though I suppose some mistake that for originality. Amara's blood ran cold, her body stiffening. The old humiliation threatened to rise again, pressing against her like a tidal wave. But before she could shrink back into herself, the woman in the navy coat turned to Mr. Whitman. Her expression was firm, her voice carrying a weight that silenced those around her. Unpolished, perhaps, she said, but sometimes unpolished work speaks truths that perfection hides. This piece has soul. You can feel the struggle in every contour. It's more than technique. It's alive. The critic beside her nodded in agreement. Yes, it demands attention. It unsettles you in the right way. That is not something you can teach. It is something born of the artist herself. Amara's breath caught. For a moment, the crowd blurred, her vision swimming with the realization of what had just happened. Strangers, professionals, saw her. They defended her work. They believed in it, even when her own teacher refused to. Her mother, standing a few steps away, caught her eye and gave her the slightest nod, her lips curving into a proud, knowing smile. The rest of the afternoon passed in a surreal haze. People continued to stop at her pedestal, discussing the sculpture, photographing it, asking questions she barely had the confidence to answer. Each interaction chipped away at the shadow of doubt she had carried since that first day of laughter in class. By the time the exhibition closed for the day, Amara's nerves had not disappeared, but something else had grown stronger inside her, a certainty. Her work belonged here. She belonged here. Would you like me to carry this forward into Chapter 6, where the sculpture doesn't just receive attention but begins gaining momentum among the judges, leading up to the shocking announcement of the Global Exhibition Prize? The second day of the exhibition arrived with a palpable sense of anticipation. Unlike the opening day, when people wandered casually between displays, today was when the judges would make their rounds. These were not just local critics or art enthusiasts. These were curators from major museums, gallery owners, and representatives from international cultural organizations. They carried clipboards and wore the kind of calm, evaluating expressions that made every artist's pulse quicken. Amara stood near her sculpture again, her palms clammy despite the chill of the hall's air conditioning. She had hardly slept the night before, lying awake as memories of the woman in the navy coat replayed in her mind. Her strong, confident defense of the piece. It gave Amara courage, but also sharpened the stakes. If yesterday had been about attention, today was about judgment. The judges began moving in groups of 2 or 3, stopping at each artwork, taking notes, asking a few questions if the artist happened to be nearby. Their voices were low, but their pens moved steadily. When they were unimpressed, their visits were brief. When they were intrigued, they lingered. Amara watched them from across the room at first. They spent a long while at a massive oil painting filled with intricate, photorealistic detail, murmuring their admiration. She felt a pang of intimidation. How could her rough clay form compete with something so flawless, so traditional? She reminded herself of what she had overheard yesterday. It's alive. She clung to those words like a lifeline. Finally, the cluster of judges approached her pedestal. They stopped in front of her sculpture and went quiet. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. One judge, an older man with silver hair and a dark-tailored suit, tilted his head, studying the figure with piercing eyes. Another, a younger woman with short hair and thick glasses, walked around it slowly, crouching slightly to see it from different angles. A third tapped the end of his pen against his notebook, frowning thoughtfully. Amara held her breath. This, the man in the suit finally said, his voice low but carrying, is not afraid of itself. The woman with glasses nodded. There is a vulnerability here. The uneven textures, the rawness. It refuses to hide the process. It invites us into it instead. The third judge scribbled something, then asked aloud, "Who is the artist?" Amara's throat tightened. For a heartbeat, she considered staying silent, hiding behind the crowd. But then she stepped forward. I am, she said, her voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. All 3 turned toward her. The woman in glasses smiled gently. Tell us about it. Amara swallowed hard. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs, but something in their expectant gazes gave her strength. I wanted to make something that wasn't perfect, she began. Something that showed struggle and pain, but also resilience. I wanted it to look like it had been through something. Because people go through things and they don't come out smooth and polished. They come out changed, marked. That's what I wanted to capture. There was another silence. But this time, it was different. The judge's expression shifted, softer, deeper, tinged with something close to respect. The man in the suit wrote something quickly on his clipboard. Thank you, he said, inclining his head slightly. Then they moved on. Amara stood frozen, her body tingling, her chest filling with air that felt both heavy and freeing. She couldn't be sure what their notes meant, but she knew one thing. They had listened. Really listened. Throughout the day, whispers began to circulate. She caught fragments of conversations between attendees, people talking about the sculpture, about the raw clay piece that made the judges stop. Even students from other schools, once dismissive, now eyed her work with a mixture of surprise and unease. It was as if the tide of opinion was shifting right before her eyes. Mr. Whitman, however, seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Amara noticed him hovering nearby, intercepting conversations, offering subtle but dismissive comments about her piece's lack of refinement or student-level execution. But the more he tried to downplay it, the more others seemed to push back, defending its boldness, its originality. His authority in the classroom didn't carry the same weight here. By the end of the day, Amara felt as though she were walking through a dream. Her sculpture was no longer the forgotten, mocked object at the back of a classroom. It was a topic of discussion among professionals, a work that demanded to be looked at twice. For the first time in her life, she felt her voice, not just her literal voice, but her artistic one, had echoed into a space larger than she had ever thought possible. That evening, as she packed up to leave, Her mother put a hand on her shoulder. "Do you realize what's happening?" she whispered. "They see you, truly see you, and they're not going to forget." Amara didn't know what the final decisions of the judges would be. But walking out of the exhibition hall, the night air cool against her skin, she realized that the seed of belief in herself, fragile, small, but real, had finally taken root. The final day of the exhibition dawned with a sense of electricity in the air. The massive gallery hall was brighter than ever, sunlight streaming in through the high windows, as if nature itself had decided to spotlight the moment. Rows of students, parents, teachers, and art enthusiasts filled the space, their voices buzzing with excitement and tension. Today was the awards ceremony, the culmination of weeks of preparation, and for the young artists, it meant validation or heartbreak. Amara stood near the back of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her sculpture sat on its pedestal across the hall, unchanged, yet somehow transformed in her eyes. What had once been a lump of clay mocked in her classroom now stood as a symbol of her persistence, resilience, and courage. Still, her heart pounded violently in her chest. Part of her wanted to believe in everything she had overheard, the judges' praise, the murmurs from critics, but another part of her clung to caution. She had been dismissed before. She knew what it felt like to hope and be crushed. Her mother and younger brother flanked her, both practically glowing with pride. Her brother whispered, "They're going to call your name. I know it," his voice brimming with certainty. Amara smiled weakly but didn't answer. On the stage at the front of the hall, a distinguished host in a sleek black suit tapped the microphone, silencing the crowd. Behind him, a long table of judges sat, their expressions composed but unreadable. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host began, his voice booming and theatrical, "we are gathered today to celebrate not just art, but the power of vision, courage, and creativity in the next generation of artists." Polite applause followed. Amara's stomach twisted as the host announced the categories: painting, digital art, mixed media, sculpture. Her heart skipped when he reached sculpture, her category. In third place, he announced, for technical mastery and detail beyond her years, the award goes to Clara Mitchell for her marble bust. A girl with blonde hair stepped forward, radiant with joy, her classmates cheering wildly. Clara's piece had been flawless, traditional, exactly what Amara had feared her work would never measure up to. In second place, the host continued, for innovation and bold execution, the award goes to Ethan Clark for his abstract glass installation. A tall boy with a quiet smile received his ribbon, the light catching on the multicolored shards of his piece. Applause echoed again, louder this time. Amara's chest tightened. Her name hadn't been called yet. Was this it? Would she be left unmentioned, her work remembered only as a curiosity? The host adjusted his papers, his voice carrying a dramatic pause. And finally, the first prize in the sculpture category, which also qualifies as the overall grand award for the entire exhibition. The crowd leaned forward, hushed. Amara's breath caught in her throat. Goes to Amara Johnson for her extraordinary piece that captured the essence of human struggle and resilience in a form both raw and profoundly moving. The hall erupted in applause. For a moment, Amara stood frozen, unable to process the words. Her brother tugged at her arm, shouting, "It's you! You won!" Her mother's eyes filled with tears, her face breaking into the widest smile Amara had ever seen. As if moving in a dream, Amara walked toward the stage. The clapping grew louder, a wave of sound that seemed to push her forward. Some people stood to their feet, applauding with genuine fervor. She could feel every gaze on her, but this time it wasn't judgment, it was recognition. When she reached the stage, the host shook her hand warmly and handed her a gleaming plaque. The judges nodded at her, their eyes filled with respect. One even leaned in and whispered, "Your voice matters. Don't ever forget that." Amara blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. She looked out into the crowd and saw her classmates. Many of them were wide-eyed, their earlier skepticism shattered. Even Mr. Whitman was there, stiff in the corner, his face pale and unreadable. For once, his authority meant nothing. Amara lifted the plaque slightly, her hands trembling. A surge of pride and relief swept through her, a warmth that filled her chest and radiated outward. This was more than just an award. This was proof that her art, her voice, had value, that despite prejudice, dismissal, and doubt, she had risen and been seen for who she was. That night, as she carried the plaque home, Amara thought of all the times she had nearly given up, all the nights of doubt, the moments of ridicule, the sting of her teacher's laughter, and yet, here she was, not defeated, not invisible, but celebrated. For the first time in her life, she felt truly unstoppable.